Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. We're executive directors of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. How much of the January 6th insurrection was due to Christian supremacy? Our guest today says a lot.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at ffrf.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
How much of the January 6th insurrection was due to Christian nationalism? Our guest today will tell us how much. Matthew D. Taylor is a religious studies scholar and expert in independent charismatic Christianity and Christian nationalism. He's creator and narrator of the Charismatic Revival Fury series on Straight White American Jesus podcast, and he's the author of the book Scripture People. He's currently a senior scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore.
Matthew Taylor's newest book, just released, is called The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening democracy. Thank you so much for joining us today, Matthew.
Thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be here.
What a fascinating book. I read every single page. You certainly did a lot of research. You say you wrote this book in order to understand the ringleaders and the principal theological architects of the Capitol riot. What's the significance of the title of your book, The Violent Take It by Force?
The title actually comes from the mouth of Jesus, according to the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 11, Jesus is reflecting on the death of his cousin, John the Baptist. This is evidently a fairly recent event in the timing of the passage. And he makes this cryptic comment, and he says, since the days of John the Baptist, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. And Christians have been divided through the centuries in terms of how to understand this comment. Is Jesus saying that to be Christian means that you will suffer violence, that this is a description of the life of Christians and the opposition they'll receive? Is he saying that he's using violence as a positive metaphor? Oh, we should be like violent people in the way that we passionately grab hold of the kingdom of heaven? Well, the Capitol rioters were constantly citing this verse and on their social media, in their messages to each other. And the way that they understood this verse was that it was a mandate for them to do spiritual violence, to battle back the demons that they believed were trying to hijack the election. And they imagined that the Trump administration was representative of the kingdom of heaven, and that it was being stolen, it was being taken away by violent people, and that they needed to be violent to take it back.
So this shows the danger of having a holy book or so-called holy book that people cherry pick. How did religion serve as the propellant, as you say, for January 6th?
There were a lot of different types of Christians who showed up on January 6th using a variety of different theologies. But I argue in my book that the dominant strand of Christianity that showed up on January 6th is what we would call the independent charismatic strain of evangelicalism. So this is, independent here is a synonym for non-denominational. So we're talking here about where non-denominational governance meets charismatic spirituality. And charismatic is a term of art within Christian theology and practice. Baptists, referring to forms of Christianity that are very interested in the supernatural dimensions of Christianity. Things like speaking in tongues, things like modern day prophecy or miracles and healing. So these independent charismatic leaders were using Christian theology, using Christian frameworks, both to galvanize Christians to be there that day, to mobilize Christians to be there that day. And we know that thousands of Christians showed up, and you can see the Christian symbolism, especially evangelical symbolism, throughout the crowds on the day of the Capitol riot. But they were also very important for motivating the Christians who were there and offering them theological rationales for why they needed to do this. And as I was hinting at, a lot of this centered on a concept called spiritual warfare. The idea that there are angels and demons battling all around us, and that Christians can participate in spiritual warfare, in this warfare between angels and demons, and through practices like prayer, through singing worship songs, through even blowing shofars, these ritual ram's horns that originate in Jewish liturgical practice.
I remember when I was growing up in charismatic church, we used to sing that song as children. I may never march in the infantry, but I'm in the Lord's army. So, I used to preach that, so I know what you're talking about. But you also talk about something I had not really heard about too much, the New Apostolic Reformation, which is known as the NAR. And let me just quote, you say the NAR leaders' militant theologies, violent rhetoric, and Christian mobilization efforts were inextricable from the happenings at the Capitol riot. What is the NAR, and how powerful is it?
The New Apostolic Reformation is a set of leadership networks centered here in this kind of non-denominational charismatic space. It had at its peak hundreds of leaders. It was really kind of organized in the late 1990s and early 2000s by a renegade seminary professor named C. Peter Wagner. And the idea of the NAR was that the church needed the renewed leadership and the renewed offices of apostles and prophets. These are ancient forms of Christian leadership that we find described in the New Testament. Most Christian traditions would say, though, there are not contemporary apostles and prophets. Those were special roles at the founding of the church that Jesus commissioned them at the time, and now we've evolved into other forms of leadership. But the NAR was saying, no, we need apostles and prophets now. And almost all the people who joined up with these networks under Peter Wagner believed that they were apostles and prophets. In terms of their influence, they're very influential in terms of ideas. In terms of the reach of the NAR, there's probably hundreds, maybe into the low thousands of churches that affiliate with these NAR networks. But these aren't formal networks. You're not going to find a database anywhere. You're not going to find an NAR statement of faith. These are very loose relational networks among these leaders where they were working out these theologies and these ideas. And the leaders that Wagner mentored have become true celebrities in the charismatic world, and many of the people he mentored showed up that day on January 6th.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how many NAR leaders were at the January 6th insurrection.
The boundaries of the NAR can be a little hard to determine. I have identified 60 independent charismatic leaders, everywhere from a pastor of a local church up to global charismatic celebrity prophet that were there in Washington, D.C. for January 6th. There were 5 members of Wagner's inner circle who were present in some form at the Capitol riot. And these are all people that were directly mentored by him.
And you also write that since these people think that our country should be governed by theocratic rule, by God, that they're really intrinsically opposed to democracy itself. Is that what's happening in the movement?
You know, sometimes, and this is true around the world when we talk about democracy, people, the rhetoric of democracy is very popular. Many people will try to use the rhetoric of democracy, but they will not necessarily always intend liberal democracy the way we think of it. I would say that the NAR is antithetical to liberal democracy, liberal with a lowercase l, by which we mean where people have liberty, where people have rights, where we have the rule of law, where there's equality of all citizens. For the NAR, I would call it a Christian supremacist movement. in that they believe that Christians are intrinsically better than other people, that Christians have a morality that is superior to all other religions. Christians have truth with a capital T, and they believe that Christians should therefore be in charge of society, and that Christians should organize societies, every society, around Christian values and their conservative Christian principles.
So you've written that the charismatic theology is a civic menace to American democracy. So why is that?
To be clear, I'm not saying that all charismatic theology is a menace to civic society, because there are a lot of forms of charismaticism. There are Pentecostals are charismatic, there are charismatic Catholics, there are even leaders in this independent charismatic world who very much resist this politicization of their faith, resist this authoritarian trend that is happening in these, especially NAR circles. But the threat that I see in this charismatic theology is that they have built an entire way of understanding Christianity around these apostles and prophets who exercised a sort of oligarchic spiritual control over these networks. The apostles and prophets brook no compromise. They resist other leaders, they resist accountability, and so they have kind of created their own little fiefdoms of power and authoritarian leadership. And these have been some of the frontline leaders to endorse Donald Trump. And they've offered theologies to justify Trump to broader evangelicalism, ideas that harken back to the divine right of kings. They believe that Donald Trump is anointed for office. They believe that he is destined by God to not only have served one term, but to serve another term. They have many, many prophecies from their prophets saying that Donald Trump is a special kind of leader, almost attaching a kind of quasi-messianic quality to him. And to me, that in and of itself is a threat to liberal democracy, in that democracy is about the will of the demos. It's about the will of the people. It's about our adjudication and arguments with each other. When you introduce people saying, I know with certainty that the will of God is that X person be elected, and then they're willing to take anti-democratic action, as we saw on January 6th, and really as we saw in the entire Stop the Steal campaign, that it undermines the very foundations of how we understand democracy. I am totally fine with Christians and even charismatic Christians voting and participating in our democracy. I think that is part of the basic freedoms, part of the basic pluralism of our society. The challenge is when people decide that God is telling them that they need to overturn the current regime or hold on to power even after the democratic will of the people has said it's time for you to leave.
You know, this group, even within Christianity, these people were kind of viewed as the fringe, years ago, up until not too recently, actually. But you write that the carpet has now become the fringe. How did that happen?
Yeah, I'm actually quoting one of the chiefs of staff of George W. Bush, Andy Card, who was originally used this analogy about the fringe and the carpet. Part of the process of how this happened, and it actually is parallel in some ways to what has happened in the Republican Party overall. I mean, you think about what the Republican Party looks like today, where you have figures like Steve Bannon or Roger Stone at the center of our politics, or Michael Flynn, these characters that by all rights should be fringe characters in American politics, and were fringe in the Republican Party in 2015 when Donald Trump entered the scene. But Donald Trump has elevated these figures, and in fact, he's elevated these fringe characters, these fringe ideas, to the point where what was mainstream Republican even 10 years ago is now, many of those people wouldn't even call themselves Republican anymore because they've been pushed so far to the margins. A similar thing has happened within the religious right in America and within American evangelicalism. That these were the leaders, some of the first leaders to meet with Donald Trump when he became a candidate in 2015. A lot of this hinges on Trump's personal religious advisor, his personal pastor, Paula White Cain, who I have a whole chapter about in my book. And Trump turned to Paula White Cain in the summer of 2015, right as he was entering the race, and said, I want you to be my liaison to the evangelicals. Now, Paula White Cain didn't know mainstream evangelicals because she herself was a charismatic televangelist, a female preacher, which many evangelicals don't accept, and a prosperity gospel person. And so she started bringing in the kinds of people that she knew apostles and prophets from the NAR, televangelists, charismatic megachurch pastors, messianic rabbis. And these are some of the first religious leaders to meet with Donald Trump in the fall of 2015. And as Donald Trump wins and consolidates the primaries, these fringe figures move into the center of the action because they're the ones who got in at the ground level. And by the end of the 2016 primary, you have this inversion of power on the religious right, where the mainstream kind of old guard establishment of the religious right are now on the margins and having to try to get access to Trump through Paula White Cain and her coterie of prosperity gospel preachers and apostles and prophets.
Yeah, because a lot of Christians think that's kind of nutty stuff. What she believes in, how do you describe it? Territorial demonism and powers and all of that happening. But I want to ask, we saw in video of the insurrection some of these flags called Appeal to Heaven, and you write about that. What can you tell us about these Appeal to Heaven, with the pine tree in it in the middle?
Yeah, the Appeal to Heaven flag is a Revolutionary War flag. It was commissioned by George Washington, and it was commissioned actually to fly over the Massachusetts Navy. This was commissioned in 1775, in fact, right before the Revolution started. It was one of many Revolutionary War flags. There were a bunch of different flags that were flown. But in 2013, one of these NAR leaders, a guy named Dutch Sheets, discovers this flag, and he believes that he receives a prophecy about this flag, that it is a prophetic symbol of a new spiritual revolution in America. This is right in the middle of the Obama administration, right after the start of Obama's second term. And Dutch Sheets viewed Obama himself as inspired by and led by demons. And so he believed that we needed to overthrow the liberal tyranny of the Obama administration, and he began campaigning and popularizing the symbol of this Appeal to Heaven flag, encouraging other Christians to use it. These NAR networks rolled out a whole campaign of popularizing this flag, and that flag was everywhere on January 6th. I argue that Dutch Sheets was one of the most effective Christian leaders mobilizing Christians to show up on January 6th. And this flag continues to be very, very popular in far-right Christian circles. We know that Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, flies an Appeal to Heaven flag outside of his congressional office today. It was given to him by some NAR leaders. We also found out that Samuel Alito, the Supreme Court Justice, flew an Appeal to Heaven flag. He blamed it on his wife over their summer house in the summer of 2023 for at least a few weeks. So this symbol has proliferated, but it finds its origin not merely in the Revolutionary War, but in its modern popularization through the NAR as a symbol, a coded symbol of this prophecy and spiritual warfare.
We're speaking with Matthew D. Taylor about his fascinating new book and chilling new book, The Violent Take It by Force. And when we come back, Matthew, we'd like to ask you about the Seven Mountain Mandate and Dominion theology.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
Christian nationalists are mobilizing. They want to turn America into a Christian theocracy. Our secular democracy is in danger. All personal liberties are in jeopardy. Vote like your rights depend on it. And join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, an association of atheists and agnostics working to keep religion and government separate.
Welcome back to Freethought Matters. We're continuing our conversation with Matthew D. Taylor about his new book, The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening democracy.
So Matthew, you say that Trump has pantomimed the televangelists. What do you mean by that?
You know, a lot of this actually comes from Paula White Cain herself. In her book, Something Greater, that came out in 2019, she tells the story. She narrates her relationship with Trump. He called her out of the blue in 2002. He had seen her preaching on TV when he was in Mar-a-Lago, and he told her that you have the it factor. And her response was, "Sir, we call that the anointing." And she goes on to describe how Trump recounts to her several of her own sermons, almost point by point, and how then he goes on to start describing the different televangelists he's been watching over the decades, and the ways that his criticisms of them, his highlights, his things that he thought they did very well. Trump actually grew up attending the church of Norman Vincent Peale, a kind of famous, kind of bourgeois prosperity gospel preacher in New York. He was the one who coined this idea, the power of positive thinking. So Trump has been watching preachers his entire life. And I would argue that you can even hear the echoes of Norman Vincent Peale's ideas in a lot of the ways that Trump speaks at his rallies, the kind of constant positivity about himself, the refusal to accept anything negative about himself or his movement. So he's been immersed in this world. He's been paying attention to this world. And I'd argue that his religious advisors, especially Paula White Cain, have come alongside him and offered him a new religious register, a new religious vocabulary that he has learned how to use. And you can hear it in the way that Trump now appeals to persecuted Christians, where he says, "Oh, we're going to have a Christian visibility day if I get elected again." He is playing into the fears of evangelicals, the paranoia of many evangelicals, and he's offering them promises that he will be their protector, he will be their retribution.
He doesn't sound like the Trump of even 20 years ago. He's been converted, I suppose. The Seven Mountain Mandate. I was surprised in your book that you write that 1/5 of all Americans have embraced the Seven Mountain Mandate. What is that?
Seven Mountain Mandate is another of these prophecies. I call them in my book prophetic memes, right? They're prophecies that come from these charismatic prophets, but they travel around in charismatic media more like memes, where they get repackaged, repurposed. So the Seven Mountains is one of the most important of these prophetic memes. It's both a prophecy and an outline for social change. It was created or conceptualized by one of Peter Wagner's disciples, a man named Lance Wallnau. He was one of the first Christian leaders to endorse Trump in 2015. But the idea of the Seven Mountain Mandate is you can divide society up into 7 different arenas of influence: the government, education, the family, religion, arts and entertainment, media, commerce, and that they imagine each of those as a mountain. And the top of that mountain in every society has these 7 mountains, and the tops of those mountains are either controlled by Satan and the demons or by God and the Christians. There's no kind of middle ground. It's a totally Manichaean understanding of society. And the mandate part of it is that they believe that Christians are called by God to ascend to the tops of the mountains, to take control over each of the 7 mountains, and then let Christian influence flow down into society. I've sometimes talked about it as a form of trickle-down theocracy, right? You take over the positions of power in society, and then you let Christian influence and morality flow down into society. And so the 7 Mountains has become this incredibly popular idea in the charismatic world. The NAR networks have popularized it and spread it like the same way that they have with the Appeal to Heaven flag, as a kind of meme of Christian supremacy. And it has become a framework that many Christian nationalists, including non-charismatic Christian nationalists, have adopted as a program for how do you go about Christianizing a society. Well, the 7 Mountains offers you a kind of structured program for that.
So Jesus is going to control Hollywood and Broadway, the entertainment? And what would that actually look like?
They'll talk about that each of the mountains has its own culture. And in order to conquer that mountain, you need to understand the culture of that mountain. So in the church mountain or the religion mountain, maybe it's about morality and piety, but that's not the rules for these other mountains. For instance, Peter Wagner would sometimes say, well, in Hollywood, you have to be attractive to get ahead. And so attractive Christians who have the capacity to be actors should go into Hollywood, try to ascend as high as they can in Hollywood. Or maybe if you aren't attractive, maybe you need to become a Hollywood executive and become somebody high up who's actually deciding which movies are being made. And then you're in the room, you're in the halls of power behind the actual production that's going on. And similarly, in a field like arts and entertainment, they say Christian artists should be as good as they possibly can be and even ascend to places of power. Maybe they even need to downplay their Christianity early on and then let it come out later on once they've attained this position of power.
So here's the million-dollar question. How did Donald Trump, a thrice-married, notorious reprobate and real estate tycoon, win over millions of evangelical voters and gain their undying loyalty ever since 2016?
That is the question I'm trying to explore with my book. And I think that these NAR leaders and their theologies were central to that story. They are the ones who have really propagandized and theologized Donald Trump. They have offered their prophecies and their rationales that say to Christians, this is how you should understand Donald Trump. I mean, in 2016, if you remember back to that campaign, there were many evangelicals, especially evangelical elites, who were very reluctant about Trump. They really didn't like him. They saw him as a reprobate. They saw him as immoral. And of course, especially after the Access Hollywood tape came out, you would think that values voters would run away from a candidate like Donald Trump. But the NAR, and especially people like Lance Wallnau and Dutch Sheets, came along and said, Donald Trump is anointed for office. He may not be a good Christian. He may not be someone that is moral. But God has put him in office for a purpose. God has given him this special anointing and said, you are the one that I want to lead this nation. And so they were able to reconcile themselves with Trump's immorality by saying that he is not a good Christian, but he's an instrument in the hand of God, anointed as a sort of secular savior to protect Christians and to be the bully on behalf of conservative Christianity.
So you write in your book, there are few more dangerous moments in a democracy than when the purported voice of God supplants the voice of the people. So we think your book is so important. Any final words?
Just one comment. Towards the end of September of 2024, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, the same man who's got an appeal to heaven flag flying outside his office, made the comment on a prayer call with Paula White Cain, I believe that God has chosen Donald Trump to once again lead our nation. This is the second in line to the presidency, the Speaker of the House of Representatives who is saying this. That is a scary, scary statement to me. And I say this as a Christian. I say this as somebody who believes in God. I don't want Mike Johnson telling us who God has chosen, and I worry that Mike Johnson will be in a position where he's going to get to do something about who he believes God has chosen to be president.
Matthew Taylor's book is called The Violent Take It by Force. Thank you so much for joining us today, Matthew.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.